So now we've learned how to create a named router outlet. We've learned how to navigate to one and destroy one when we navigate somewhere else by resetting the pane to null. What we're going to do is now create a resolve for our second outlet and actually load the data in. Now for this, what we can do is quickly look at our mail module, and we're going to add a resolve to our named outlet. Now this is nice and easy because we have learned about this in a previous video. So we can go ahead and create the resolve property. Now at this point, what I'm going to call it is message because we have messages. So this one is going to be a single message. Now what we're going to call it is the mail view resolve. So we can go ahead and create the file for this. We can say mail-view.resolve.ts. Now inside of here, what we're going to do is use our mail service and we'll add a new method to it. And we're going to use that method inside of here. So let's go ahead and set up our resolve. We can import the injectable from @angular/core. We can mark our class as injectable and we'll give it that name of mail view resolve. And then we can implement the resolve. Now this time, instead of an array of mail, what we're going to return is just a single item. So we can leave the actual type definition as just the mail, and we can call that resolve function. When we learned about the resolve function, we learned that we had a root, which had a type of activated root snapshot. And we also learned about this state. Now we don't need the state. So what we're going to do is just leave that off. However, we can import this type from the Angular/router just to make sure everything is type checked correctly. So the next thing we can do is import our mail service, and we want to go up a few directories and reference our mail service. We also want to import our mail interface. So what we can do is go ahead and grab that as well. We need to go back a few directories and we'll jump into the models folder, followed by the mail interface. So this mail is then being passed into our resolve, and we can go ahead now and inject our mail service. So we'll create the constructor. We'll say it's going to be private. We'll call this one the mail service with lowercase, and we'll just finalize the constructor. Now what we want to do is return a method from our service. So we can do return this.mail service. Now what we're going to do for this method is call a get message function, and we're going to pass the root.params. We're going to grab that unique ID. So the ID then corresponds to our mail module, which is this ID here. So what we're going to do is simply ask for it in our resolve. Now before we go any further, what we're going to do is just quickly add these to our module so we can save out our resolve. We can copy our class name, and what we're going to do is import it next to our other resolve. So we can replace the value to mail view resolve. This one is inside our components folder, and we're going to change these over to mail view. We can bump this one up because it's in the components folder, not the containers folder. And we can go ahead and register our resolve next to the other one inside our providers. We also have the resolve, which is then pointing to our mail view resolve that we just created. We can close off our module. So the next piece, we want to jump into our mail service and add our get message. So what we can do is open this one up, and on the component class, we can say get message. So what we get here is the ID with a type of string. We could change this over to a number. However, because we're actually concatenating it into a string similar to above, where we pass the dynamic folder name into the string, we could do the exact same thing in here. However, we don't actually need to query the folder equals. We just need to put a /. So the db.json is actually set up so when we navigate to /messages /1, for example, it will actually return us this ID of 1, similarly to 2, 3, and 4. So this is basically dynamically passing that ID in for us and then returning that observable. Now, just like above, we want to add the type definition of the observable, and here we're just returning the single mail item because it's a specific ID. Now what we need to do is jump back into our resolve. Now to satisfy the resolve, we just need to import this type definition. So everything here is good to go. We're returning this observable, which gets called from our resolve. So now we can go ahead and save this out. And just like we learned in the previous resolve video where we learned more in depth about the resolve, we need to actually jump into our component and resolve the data. Now the component that will display each message is this component here, the mail view component. Now similar to before, what we need to do is go ahead and reference our router. So just like in one of the previous videos where we learned about the resolve, we need to import the activated route. This will give us the .data where we can actually reference the message property. So we'll go ahead and import that from the Angular router. Now we need to inject this route into our component class so we can create that constructor. We can say private route is going to be of type activated route. Now when we actually look at the route, we're going to have a data object that we need to fetch the data from. So if we jump into the mail folder, in the previous lessons, what we did was look at the messages. We said it's going to be of type observable and it returns us an array of mail. And then we did this.route.data.pluck to get that particular property and bind it to messages. So we need to do something pretty similar in this component. So on our component, I'm going to create a message property that we're going to go and use in our template. It's going to return us an observable, which is just going to be a single mail item. And the way that we can get this is by referencing this.route.data. And we're going to use the same approach as before with the pluck method. And we can just ask for that message property. Now this pluck method where we're asking for the message, if we jump into our mail module, what we actually have is this resolve property called message. So this is exactly what we're asking for when we do route.data.pluck. The next piece, what we need to do just to make these types actually work, we can import the observable from rxjs/observable. We also need to import our mail type, so we can go ahead and go up a few directories to our models folder /mail.interface. So now our observable is then type checked. We're returning a single mail item, which is the message that we're plucking. And we need to bind that observable to the view. Now, there's one interesting thing here is that the pluck in the previous lesson, we actually used the add operator, as you can see at the top of this file. Now, if I go ahead and remove this, you can see that when we switch back, pluck is no longer available. Now, this means that when we add the pluck operator here, it becomes available on all of our observables. So we don't technically need to add it again. However, if we were to delete this, things would be affected. So at this point, it may be a good idea to actually import the pluck, even though we've used it elsewhere, just to make sure that we're actually using it safely. Now the final piece of this, because we have the pluck, which is returning us the observable mail, we need to bind our message to the DOM. What we're going to do inside our template is create an H2, and we're also going to create a p tag. So what we actually want to reference inside of these is our message, which is going to be delivered to us asynchronously. So this is actually subscribing to the observable via the async pipe. Now at this point, the message is in fact asynchronous. However, what we can do is put the from property outside of these braces here, just to denote the fact that this is the asynchronous piece. Now you may be thinking, where does the from come from? If we jump into the db.json, all the from property contains is the name of the sender for our email. Similarly, what we want to do is also copy this, and we can put the actual full message inside the p tag. However, what we're going to do is just quickly add a new property to each of these objects. So right next to the timestamps, what I'm going to add is another property, and we can just say full, and that is going to contain the full message. So all we're going to do is full message from, and for each of these, what we can do is just append their names to them, so we actually know who they're from, and we get the unique names for each of our users. So we have full message from, full message from, full message from, and finally we can add the first item in our array. Now we can save this. However, what we need to do is open up our terminal, and because we're changing things inside the db.json, we just need to actually cancel the operation, start that again, which will then make this new data available to us. Once it's restarted, we can close it off, and what we'll be able to see in the browser is the name of the message, who it's from, and their full message. So when we land in the browser, we have /inbox, we can click on Jane Smith, we have her name at the top, we have full message from, we can click on the next item, we have the name, we click on the next item, we can navigate across to trash, nothing is appearing, we can click, the URL has changed, and this is preloading the data with the root resolve. We can confirm this if we open up the Chrome DevTools, jump into our network tab. Now if we go ahead and select Jane, you can see at the bottom API/1 has actually been hit. If we go ahead and do the same with number 2, these are actually preloading the data before this component is instantiated. So when you're using a resolve, it's a good practice to make sure that you're not overloading your resolves so the users end up waiting a long time for their data to appear. Now this may be where we want to introduce something like a loading bar or something like this just to indicate to the user that something's happening. In this lesson, what we're going to learn is something called lazy loading. Lazy loading is a term for when we can essentially split up chunks of code and request them on demand. Now, what I've actually done is change some things inside our mail application. So we're not actually doing /folder/inbox anymore. We're actually containing that URL under the mail. So this indicates that we have some kind of mail module. Now we've also introduced a dashboard root, which is a dashboard module, which contains a dashboard component. Now in our case, our dashboard component doesn't actually do much. However, it may contain a lot of code. So let's assume that we are using our inbox and users don't typically visit the dashboard. However, when they click on the dashboard, it might be nice to actually go and fetch the code that's related to the dashboard module so that our initial payload for the JavaScript files that we download in the browser are much smaller. And when we go ahead and navigate to dashboard, we can then go and request the dashboard module. So at the moment, we've got the inbox module, which is our mail module, and we've also got the dashboard module. So we've got two different modules that we've set up, and we're going to learn in this video how to lazy load the dashboard module, and we'll actually see it working in the Chrome DevTools. When we lazy load, we'll actually see a request to this JavaScript file when we split it out. So what we'll do is have a look inside our app module. We'll start from the top. We have our mail module as usual. We also have our dashboard module, which has also been included inside our imports. Now let's go and have a look inside the mail module because we talked about the new routing structure. So we'll have a look inside of here. There's nothing too special that's actually going on. All I've done is create a path called mail. So all of our inbox and trash related components and services, anything that we use will be underneath /mail in the URL, followed by the folder name and all of these kind of things. We also have the message that we want to request and the ID, and we're using the outlets and the resolves like we were in previous videos. So we've essentially shifted these down and put them inside a mail path. So that's the only change that we've made inside the mail module. What we'll do is quickly have a look inside the mail item component. So we've actually changed the router link to look at /mail, which is an absolute path from /mail. And then everything is the same as we have coded out in the previous videos. And finally, what the other change that we've made in our app component, where we had our inbox with the router link, I've added a /mail to both of these and a /dashboard to these. So it might be that inside the dashboard that we do build out some features such as the dashboard settings or these kind of things where we can go ahead and route to different components. Now I've also changed out the mail app, which was inside of here, to just use a router outlet instead of hard coding the mail app as we did in previous videos. So we're using a router outlet which allows our app module to actually go ahead and start routing to things based on each module's routing definitions. So inside the mail module, we have particular routing definitions, we have the mail, and inside the dashboard module, we have a simple path, we have a simple component. It doesn't really do anything, it just displays the word dashboard. But we could obviously build this out as a big feature module like this in our mail app with all our components, services, and containers. So all we have here is our root definition. We have a path of dashboard related to the dashboard component. And all we're simply doing is exporting the module. Instead of actually routing to the component directly, what we could do is actually delete the path to the dashboard module and then remove it from our imports. So now we have essentially made the dashboard module completely disappear because we're not loading it at runtime. So what we want to actually do is effectively lazy load it. Now the way that we can do this is adding a property to our routes in the app module. So we need to do this in the base because the app module will be responsible for loading our dashboard module. Now what we need to do is go ahead and create a path. We'll say we want to actually create a new route called dashboard, and this will make sense momentarily. And to lazy load the module, all we need to do is set up a load children, and we need to go ahead and point to our dashboard module. So we do /dashboard/dashboard.module. Now the interesting piece, and I'll just hide the sidebar, is that we need to actually reference the name of the module inside our dashboard. So let me open up the dashboard module. Inside of here, we are exporting a class, which is our module called dashboard module. So we can copy the value dashboard module and jump into our string. Now what we actually need to tell Angular at this point is the name of the module. So this goes and fetches the file, but we may actually have multiple modules in one file. So what we do is just put a hash and then the name of the module. So this is actually requesting the entire module called our dashboard module, and we are essentially assigning it at the root level. So we're currently in the app module. We are creating a new routing definition at the base, and instead of actually importing our module in something like our root modules imports, what we're doing is asking for it on demand using load children. Now because we are creating a path with the dashboard inside, if we actually jump into our dashboard module, we actually have a duplicate path. So what we need to do at this point is just simply remove the path to the dashboard module. So what this essentially does is export the whole module with its routing definitions under a completely empty path. Now this is completely optional, and you could add another prefix. We could add anything that we like inside of here. However, we're just going to keep an empty string. Now an empty string, if we save that out, allows us to essentially reassign when this module is loaded to a custom route. So that means that when we go to /dashboard, that particular URL is going to load our module. Now, if we decided to change the dashboard to be something like settings, and we went to /settings, this would change the routes for the entire module at the base level. So we can essentially control where we want to load things, and in our case, we're going to use the dashboard. So what we'll do is save that out and go to the browser and check out what this does for us. So when we land in the browser, we can see /mail/folder/inbox. So this is all working as intended. When we click on a message, we can see all of these details. We can go to trash, we can go back to inbox. Now the interesting piece, when we click on dashboard, you can see that everything immediately loads and the URL is /dashboard. Now the interesting piece is when we go back to inbox, we can actually refresh this entire page. And what we're going to do is open up the Chrome DevTools. So if we watch carefully, when we navigate to dashboard, you can see that this request has just been made to 0.chunk.js. Now if we expand this, you can see inside of here that this code contains the entire logic for our dashboard module. So here is our dashboard component, and this is the compiled code which contains all the logic for our particular module. Now once this has been minified and compressed, this will be a lot smaller, of course. However, we still might have a lot of features to build out in a particular dashboard module. Now, there are multiple ways that you can do this, and each way can change. Depending on the setup you are using, this path here may actually change. So depending on your file structure, you may have something like app or /source. So you need to make sure that those are correct based on the setup you are using. In my case, I can just use // and I'm pointing straight to the dashboard module because I'm in the root directory. So if we expand the sidebar, inside of here we can see both of our folders, and my app module is just looking at /dashboard. Now, if you're using System.js, then things are a lot easier to get this working. However, we are using Webpack, which requires some additional configuration to actually go ahead and split these into chunks. So if I do a quick search for chunks, you can see that we have this output property here, and it's actually giving us the name. So this is actually corresponding to something like 0.chunk. Now, depending on your tooling setup, these are things that you may need to configure yourself. They don't come straight out of the box. However, the router does support these lazy loading of particular modules. And the main benefit to lazy loading is that we can ship pieces of our application at a time on demand, which means that our initial page load becomes smaller. So let's assume that we had 5 different modules for our application and each module was 1 megabyte of code. Instead of shipping 5 megabytes, we could ship that initial first module, which would just give us a 1 megabyte payload. We could then request another module, which may be 2 megabytes, and so forth. Now, typically, when you compile your code, and we'll be looking at ahead of time compilation later in this course, the bundle sizes of your code are drastically reduced, and we can actually create very, very small payloads that are just a few kilobytes. So using something like a load children to point to an existing module with the name of the module can allow us to dynamically instantiate a particular module when we hit a particular route. In this next lesson, what we're going to learn about is something called preloading strategies. Now, in the previous lesson, what we actually looked at was lazy loading our dashboard module using a load children. Now, this will asynchronously load our dashboard module when we actually navigate to /dashboard. So at this point, our dashboard module is then loaded. However, what we can actually do is tell the router configuration to preload all of our modules should we wish to adopt this particular strategy. Now, you may want to do this if you want to asynchronously load all of your lazy modules. And the way that we can do this is by specifying a property on this object as a second argument. So what we can actually do, and we'll explain this as we jump across to the browser and actually see what this gives us, is create this property preloading strategy, and we can give it the value of preload all modules. Now, at the moment, this will actually appear red because we need to import it. So what we'll do is go up and import it from the Angular router. So we're importing this preload all modules function. And if we actually click on this, we can go through to the source code. And you can see that we have a class which implements a preloading strategy, which then gives us a preload function. Now, we don't actually use this directly. This is what Angular will be using when we specify preload all modules. So to actually test this out, what we need to do is go and save it out, head off to the browser and check this out. So when we navigate across to the browser, you can see that we have this /mail. And because we're actually lazy loading this dashboard, which means that when we navigate to the dashboard, our module is then loaded in. However, because we are using a preload all modules as a preload strategy, when we actually go to inbox, we can open up the DevTools. And when we refresh, we will actually see this chunk of 0, which actually, if we open this up, corresponds to our dashboard module. Now, just to confirm that this is in fact doing what we are asking, we can go ahead and delete this piece, save it out, and we'll go back to the browser, and we won't see the 0.chunk. So here we are on /mail. We can refresh the page. Inside the network tab, we don't have any 0.chunk. So this isn't actually preloading things. However, if we were to navigate down to the dashboard, we can see down here that the 0.chunk has then been loaded, which corresponds to our dashboard code. So depending on your use case or your idea for this, you may wish to use a preloading strategy to preload all of your modules. Depending on the size or the use case, it may make sense to do something like this. Now, in the next video, what we're actually going to look at is creating a custom function to tell Angular that we only want to preload modules that we actually tell it. In the previous video, we added a preload strategy to our Angular module, and we passed in a preloading strategy of preload all modules, which we imported from the Angular router. So in this video, what we are going to do is actually write our own preload function to essentially allow us to extend Angular. So by default, Angular will not preload anything, which is why we are importing the preload modules. So what we're actually going to do is just delete the import, and we're going to import something called the preloading strategy. Now, what this will allow us to do is implement it against our own class, which will allow us to get given the routes as well as a callback function to load those routes. Now, it sounds more complex than it actually is when it comes to coding our preload strategy. So what we're actually going to do is create our own class, and we can do it in this file. So we can say export a class, and we're going to call this one the custom preload. We're going to implement the preloading strategy that we just imported from the Angular router. So this is our class setup, and now we need to go ahead and implement the interface. So you can see here that the property preload is missing in the type custom preload. So we can add our preload function, and this gives us the root, which will be of type root. Now, if I go ahead and command click on this, this will actually take me through to the source code. So we can actually see inside of here, we get given a function, which then returns an observable of type any. So what we actually need to do is something very similar. So we can say we get given the function. It's then going to return an observable with the type of any. And we can say it's going to return an observable with the type of any. Now, inside the function is where we actually want to go ahead and implement the logic for this. Now, we'll quickly go ahead and import the observable before we go any further from rxjs/observable. We also need to go ahead and import the root for type checking. So everything is now consistent. Now, what we want to do inside this preload function is go ahead and tell Angular what roots that we want to actually preload. Now, what we can do on the routing definition, so what we want to say on this particular route is that we want to add a piece of information to just say that we want to preload this particular route. Now we can add a data object to this particular route definition, and all we need to do is we can create a property saying preload true. So if we had 10 or 100 different modules, we could actually go ahead and preload just the modules that we wanted to preload, rather than using a preload all, which will then in turn load all of our modules. Now the next step is really simple. So what we need to do is return the root.data. So this is actually checking the existence that we actually have this data object. Now, if we do have the data and we also have a property on the data called preload, then all we need to do is invoke this function, which is given to us via the function arguments. Otherwise, because we need to return an observable, we can just do observable.of, and we can just return null. Now what we actually need to do is import the of for the observable. So we can do import rxjs/add/observable, and then we can import that of. So everything is working here. Our red underline has disappeared because we are now returning an observable. So this is actually all that we need to do. The router will take care of the hard work for us of iterating over the router tree, and it will check that we have these preload properties. If it does, it will then go ahead and actually call the function, which will then load our module. Now there's one final thing that we need to do, which is actually register our custom preload as a provider on our ng module, and also assign the value to our preloading strategy, where we can replace the preload all. So first we will do providers, and we'll pass the custom preload as an array value, and then we can go ahead and just replace our preload all modules with our custom preload. So we'll go ahead and save this out and go back to the browser and check this out. So when we land in the browser, we have our mail, we can click on dashboard, everything loads. However, we are interested in how these get loaded. So we'll open up the Chrome DevTools and we'll do a quick refresh. Now you can see inside of here that 0 chunk has already been loaded, even though we are at /mail. So our custom preload strategy is iterating over our root definitions and checking for the existence. And if so, it will then load the particular module that we've added preload true. So you can see inside of here, we have our familiar dashboard module and the component that we've actually used. Now, just to confirm that this is in fact working, we can go ahead and just change preload to false, and we'll save this and go and check out the network tab in the browser. So in the browser, we have our /mail, and because we have said that we do not want to preload our dashboard module, we can refresh and just check that those changes have actually persisted. So inside of here, we cannot see this 0 chunk. However, if we actually go and click on the dashboard, that's then been loaded in via the lazy loading. So in this lesson, we have implemented our own custom preload strategy. Now, just like lazy loading, this requires the tooling to support the lazy loading to then enable you to create your own data and preload true or preload false. So we actually need to have the lazy loading capability in the first place to go ahead and implement our own preloading. Now this may be useful depending on what you're trying to load or depending on what modules are trying to load as well. So what we'll do is a quick recap from the top. We import our preloading strategy. We create a class called custom preload, which implements the interface. We get given the preload function, which then gets called to all of our routes just to check if the data property exists. And if it does, we're going to call the function, which is given to us in the function arguments. And this function underneath will return an observable. Otherwise, we're just going to return our own observable. Then what we did was add a data property with preload and true. Now you don't have to call it preload. You could call it something else. And you could adopt different strategies if you wanted to preload particular items in different ways. So we could actually create multiple of these and create a specific check inside our custom preload strategy. Then what we did was add it to our providers. We specified the custom preload, and then we changed our preload all modules to our custom preload class, which then gets passed to the preloading strategy, which in turn tells the Angular router that we want to use our custom preload as the preload strategy. In this lesson, what we're going to learn about is something called a route guard. Now, a route guard is a simple function that gets called when we try and navigate or navigate away from a particular route that we are currently on. So for example, if I click on this email message, we have now navigated to a new route. Now, if, for example, we had a particular permissions, which we need to actually disable me navigating somewhere because of my level of authentication or my permissions. So in our case, what we might have is the ability to navigate between our messages. However, when we click on dashboard, this might be an admin feature. So what we're going to do is look at a routing guard that we can actually say, if you are not an admin, then we are going to disable your access to this particular route. So we have a few new additions in our code base. Let me just show you the app module. And inside the app module, we have an auth module that we're importing from here, and we're just registering it in our imports. So let's go and take a look at our auth module, which is just made up of two files at the moment. We just have the module definition, which exports an auth service, and we can go ahead and click through to this and have a look at the auth service. Now, in a real world application, using something like HTTP, WebSockets, or similar, you will be able to store something like the user in a particular service. Now, you may not do this in your auth service, however, it may be a good place. Now, on the auth service, we have a function called check permissions, and all I'm doing is using my fake user object to say that they are an admin. So when we actually return observable of, this is actually going to give us an observable of the value of true, similar to the below where we have is logged in. So these are two common use cases. We want to check the level of permissions that a user logged in may have, because they may or may not be an admin. So if they aren't an admin, we could change this to false. Now, what we're actually going to do is use our service in the auth guard that we're about to create and protect access to our dashboard module. So let's go ahead and create a new file inside our auth folder. I'm going to call this one auth.guard.ts. Now, a guard is a simple function that gets bound to a routing definition, and the function gets called before transitioning to a particular route or transitioning away. Now, there are a few types of route guards, and the first one that we're going to start with is the can load. So for now, what we're going to do is import some basics that we need to create our class, which will allow us to use an auth guard. Now, an auth guard is an injectable and it is a class. So what we can do is create an injectable, and we can say export the class called auth guard. And we're also going to create a constructor where we're going to inject our auth service. Now that is of type auth service. So what we need to do is jump up above and we can say import the auth service from /auth.service. So we're actually using the auth guard, and we'll connect this to our routing definition momentarily, but we're using the auth guard to essentially check something in our service, which in our case, we are going to check permissions to check if the user can actually access /dashboard. So before we go any further, what we're going to do is quickly save our auth guard out and just add it to our module. So we can quickly import the auth guard from the current directory /auth guard. Now this auth guard is a provider as well, so we need to actually define it in our ng module. Now that's all we need to do inside the auth module, so we can actually close that. And the next thing we want to do, as mentioned, is we want to implement an interface called canLoad. And these all come from the router. So what we'll do to begin with is import this canLoad interface from the Angular /router. And we can then jump to our class and say it implements canLoad. Now this has got a red underline, which then tells us that we do not have a property canLoad on our class. So that's what we need to add next, is the canLoad. Now the canLoad function actually gets called when we bind this guard to a routing definition. And the way that we bind it is actually adding it directly to a routing configuration. So at this point, what we can do is go ahead and import that auth guard from our auth module. So we're actually importing the auth guard from the current directory /auth guard. So this will then make it available inside our application module. And we can go down and simply add this to our routes. So we're just going to add a property saying canLoad, and you can see the other options that we're going to investigate in these few videos. So we're going to add a canLoad, which accepts an array. Now you can pass in one or multiple guards that you want to be called when you're using canLoad. So before we go any further, why are we using canLoad instead of the others? canLoad allows us to decide whether or not the current user is allowed to load our module. So this is specific to lazy loading a module or including a child module via the load children. So this is why we have canLoad and we have load children. So once we've added it to the routes, we can actually save it, because that is all we need to do. And it's important to remember the different types of guards that we do have to use them in the correct places. So we can simply save this out and jump back to our auth guard file. Now what we want to do in here is use our auth service. So what we'll do really quickly is just recap what we have inside of here. We have a check permissions function. So what we want to do is just simply return this.auth service, and we want to call that check permissions function. So this will return our observable to the canLoad function, and it will get called to any of the routes that we bind it to. Now to actually demonstrate that this is working, what we can do is jump to the auth service, and we want to say that we are not an admin. Now typically you will use this in a real world app with a user object of some kind that you're persisting on the client and the back end of whether they are some kind of admin. So we're just using our statically coded example in this video. So let's save this out and go to the browser and check out our auth guard. So when we land in the browser, we have /mail/folder/inbox. When we click on our messages, we can navigate through them as we like. We can go to trash. However, when we try and navigate to dashboard, I'm actually clicking, and the root guard, because I don't have the sufficient permissions based on my user object, I'm not actually allowed access to the dashboard. Now we can confirm this as well. If we type in dashboard and press enter, you can see that we have no routes here. We're being redirected back to the base URL. We can click on inbox and trash and navigate through these as we like. Now what we can do is actually go back and save this out as true, and then go back to the browser and just confirm that our auth guard is working. So back in the browser, we can click on a few emails and we can jump straight to the dashboard because we are allowed to access this particular route. Now what we'll do is a quick recap just to make sure we know what we're doing here. We have a new module called the auth module. We're importing an auth service and the auth guard into our providers and simply exporting the module and importing it inside our app module. We're then using the auth guard on one of our routes that's defined with a load children. We're using canLoad because we are lazy loading this particular module, our dashboard module. And the auth guard that we are using inside this particular file is importing an interface called canLoad. We then implement it and call this canLoad function. Now, you don't have to just return something like check permissions. You can jump inside these interfaces by command clicking, and you can actually see the definitions in the function arguments of what you get given. So in this case, we actually get the root definition. Now, all of these guards have different arguments that are given to you by the router. Now, if you need to use them, you can simply do something like root and import the root definition. And if you wanted to take the root argument and pass it into your particular service call, this is where you would do it. So for our video to demonstrate the can load, we are simply just returning this.auth service check permissions, which inside our function is just returning a simple observable of whether we are allowed to access the particular module based on whether we are an admin. In this lesson, what we're going to look at is a second auth guard. So inside our mail application, we have a mail module. Now inside the mail module, we have a few routing definitions and we have a few pieces of data that are being requested. Now it may be nice just to check in each of our modules that we are actually allowed to access some particular routes. So what we're going to do is add a guard called canActivate at the parent level of our routing structure to say if you're not authenticated or logged in, you're not allowed to access this route. So what we actually need to do is go ahead and import our auth guard and the auth module. Now we're doing this because we are using it inside a different module. So in the last video, we used the app module. In this one, we're going to use the mail module. So we're going to import the auth module from, and we have to go upper directory /auth/auth.module. Now we can duplicate this and quickly change these over to auth guard, and similarly on the file name. Now, because we have imported it into our mail module and we actually want to use it with our mail module, we need to include the auth module. So we're essentially passing this module around. So we can just go ahead and add it to our array of imports. Now we need to go ahead and add our auth guard to our routing definition. Now we could add these at any particular level, and you can in your own applications. However, for this, what we're going to do is use a canActivate here on the parent. Now, as we know, a root guard is just a property on the routing definition, and it just accepts an array of guards. In our case, we just have the single auth guard. Now, the interesting thing at this point is that you may be thinking, how are we using the same auth guard with a canActivate? And in the previous video, we were using a can load, and it calls the same class. Now, this is because what we need to do is implement a canActivate function inside our auth guard. So jumping inside, what we can do is go ahead and we can import the canActivate. We need to go ahead and also implement this. So we can say implement can load and the canActivate. And the function that we will call for the canActivate is actually going to be whether we are logged in or not. So we can do return this.auth service, and instead of check permissions, we're going to use is logged in. So we can simply call the function, and now we have added a canActivate to our auth guard. When our mail module routing definition looks at this auth guard, it says, okay, we have a canActivate property, therefore I can go and call this particular function. So in our mail module, the can load is completely ignored. However, in the app module, the can load isn't ignored, but the canActivate is. So it depends where you use them and how you apply them. Now, if we jump into our auth service, just to recap, we have the is logged in, which at the moment we're just returning true. So what I'm going to do is change this to false, and we're going to save it out, and we can go ahead and save our mail module out, and we'll go and check this out in the browser. So when I load the page, I'm actually restricted already. So I can't actually navigate to /folder inbox. You could see that my URL was actually wiped clean there. I can try clicking in the sidebar and nothing's working. However, I changed the property to true inside the auth service. So I'm technically an admin at this level, so I can access just the dashboard at this point. So what we'll do is a quick recap. You can use a canActivate on any particular level. We have our auth guard. Our auth guard imports the canActivate. We'll then use implements canActivate. We call the function, which returns our observable of whether we are logged in or whether we're not logged in. And all we've done is just simply add it to our routing definition. Now we can go ahead and just one more time, we can confirm that our auth guard is running. So what I'm going to do is save that out, and we'll go and test out the is logged in the browser, which will then show me my mail because I am now logged in and technically authenticated, because our root guard is making sure that I am actually authenticated before going ahead and fetching my mail. So we can start on /dashboard. I can go ahead and click on the mail. I can expand the mail. I can jump to trash. So everything in here is working perfect. So when you want to use a can activate is when you are navigating to a particular route. Just like with can load, if we jump into the source code of the can activate, we can actually see the function arguments that we are being given. We have access to the route. We have access to the state, which is a route to state snapshot. And if you need to, what you can do is actually pass the parameters or use the parameters and potentially take something like the activated route and pass it through into something like check permissions or something like is logged in. And the way that we would do this again is just passing the route and then passing the route into the service call. In this lesson, we're going to look at our next root guard called the can activate child. Now, if we jump into our mail module and inside of here, you can see that we have our can activate. Now, what this actually means is that I can activate the path of mail and all the children. However, let's assume that I want to just protect the children and we don't mind if the user actually navigates to this particular path of mail. What I'm going to do is add a quick H1 inside of our mail app, and I'm going to put the activated parent in here. This is just for display purposes, and what we'll do is just delete this after the video, but this will demonstrate what we're trying to achieve. Now, instead of using can activate with our auth guard, I'm actually going to add can activate child. Now, this means that when this gets called, our auth guard will then apply just to the children. So this means that if this passes, the user can access our path of mail and all the children. However, if it fails, it means they can access just the path, but they cannot access the children. So what we need to do to get this working is jump inside the auth guard. And all we're going to do is change this over to a can activate child. We need to go ahead and implement this interface as well. And we can just simply duplicate this function call and we'll change the function to can activate child. Now what we're going to do is, instead of doing this, we'll just hard code this as false really quickly. So our is logged in is then true. So we can see observable of true. Now what we're going to do is return false on the child. So this means that the user can actually activate the parent of mail because we do not have a guard on there at the moment. We could add a can activate guard if we wanted to block just the mail. However, at this point, we don't actually mind them visiting the mail because they haven't actually requested any of the data. So in the browser, I can land on the dashboard. Now I cannot actually navigate to inbox or trash because if you can see in the bottom left, it says localhost 4000/mail/folder/trash and the same for inbox. Now I can, however, type in mail and navigate there directly because it is the parent of our inbox and trash. So you can see here we have activated parent. However, when we go ahead and actually add folder/inbox, we get completely redirected and we're not allowed to access those routes. We can only access the dashboard. So using the can activate child comes in handy when you want to actually protect just the child routes or a subset of child routes depending on your routing structure. And the guard will get called when you try and navigate to a child of the configured object that you are trying to route to. What we're going to do is learn about something called a deactivate root guard. Now, at the moment, we've looked at different types of activation root guards. We've looked at loading and activation. However, we haven't looked at deactivation. So let's go ahead and assume that we can click on a user. We have their full message. However, we have this new addition of a reply box. So let's go ahead and type our message. However, we may decide to navigate away, at which point our entire message is then destroyed. When we go back, we cannot see our message. So what we're going to do is hook in the deactivate root guard to actually stop the user or warn the user that they're about to leave a particular route, and do they want to confirm navigating away because they may lose their changes that are being stored in our text area. So the first thing that we'll do is jump into our text area and actually have a look at what it does. So here we have the simple text area. We have a placeholder with type your reply. We have the value, which we are binding the value of reply to. Now reply is instantiated as an empty string. We're then listening to the change event, which calls the update reply function and passes in the event.target.value, which in our component class is just reassigning the this.reply to our value, which is passed in as a string. So this is essentially just doing some two-way binding. Now the interesting thing here is I've added a subscription to our params. Now the reason I'm doing this is because we want to reset this.reply every time we change a particular route so that it doesn't persist throughout the route changes. Now I can demonstrate this when we comment this out and go to the browser. If I go ahead and type in a message again, we can navigate away and you can see that my message is being persisted throughout all the different components that we're actually routing to. So what we're simply doing here is resetting the local state so we can add a new message when we navigate away. However, what we want to do is go ahead and add an auth guard that actually protects this component if they've typed a message and may have unsaved changes. Now at the moment, we don't actually need this component, so we're going to add our root guard inside the mail view. We can do mail-view.guard.ts. Now inside of here, we can do the exact same as we have before with our auth guards. So we can import the injectable from @angular/core. We also want to go ahead and import the can deactivate from the Angular router. And we can go ahead and create our injectable class. And we can go ahead and mark this as injectable. We'll create a class called the mail view guard. Now we're doing this because we are adding it inside this mail view. So this is a specific guard for a particular component. Now this is actually very interesting in the way that this works. So we can implement the can deactivate. Now this will actually stay red after we have added this can deactivate method. Now this is actually staying red because we need to pass a generic type into this interface. Now the type that we need to pass is in fact our mail view component. Now this is actually interesting because at the moment we've simply routed to things and we've made sure that the user is in fact authenticated. Now in this case, we're going to use our component, our mail view component, and by using the deactivate guard, we actually get access to the component in the deactivate function arguments. So here I can specify component, which is going to be of type mail view component. Now what we need to do inside the can deactivate is either return a Boolean as an observable or a promise, or just the primitive Boolean value. So if I go ahead and do return true, our red underline has now disappeared because we are saying that we can go ahead and deactivate, which means that we can navigate away from the particular route. Now all we're going to do for now is actually do a console log, and we're going to log out that component that's given to us via the function arguments. Now to actually go ahead and test this, we need to go and add this to a particular route of our choosing and include it in our module. Now what we're going to do is add this beneath our mail view resolve because our mail view has a resolve, and we're also going to add the guard. So we can go ahead and change the file extensions, and we now have access to our mail view guard. Now this again is a provider, so we need to go ahead and add that as a provider on our mail module, which means that we then have access to it inside our components. Now the route that we want to add this to is in fact our message/id. Now this is because the mail view component is then being displayed, which shows us our message, and inside that component we have the ability to send a reply. So what we're going to do on this routing definition is add a can deactivate. Now again, these are exactly the same. They take an array and we can just pass our mail view guard in. So let's go ahead and save that out and see what it gives us. So when we land in the browser, we can go ahead and navigate to a particular component. Now this has activated the mail view component. However, what we are using is a deactivate, which means that when we navigate away from this component, the guard is then going to be called. So we can go ahead and demonstrate that by navigating between a few components. And you can see each time that this mail view component is now available to us. So why might we want to use this inside a root guard? What we're actually going to do in our mail view component is simply do a check of whether there are unsaved changes. So what we can do is go to our component class and we're going to add a property called has unsaved changes. Now we're going to set this to false as a default value. So when the component actually loads, we do not have any unsaved changes. However, when we update the reply, we're going to toggle this and say this.unsaved changes equals true. Now we also have a button which says send, which at this point we probably want to clear those unsaved changes and say that we've actually sent the message to the server, and at this point we can then clear those unsaved changes. So all we're going to do is this.has unsaved changes equals false. Now we also want to copy this and add it inside the root param subscription so that it resets the value every single time. Now we need to do this because when we are changing and clicking on different emails, the component isn't actually destroyed. And this is because Angular is clever enough to reuse the same component each time without recreating it and destroying it each time. So what we'll do is save that out and go and check it out in the browser. So when we land on a person, we can go ahead and navigate away, and we have this unsaved changes as false. Now if we go ahead and type a reply, we can try and navigate away, and we have unsaved changes is true. We can go back in and type a message. It will then be true. However, we can click send, and this will then revert it back if we click away to false. Now you might be thinking at this point, why have we gone and done this? So we actually have access to the component in our guard. So at this point, what we can do is if the component has unsaved changes, we can actually alert the user and say, are you sure you want to navigate away? So what we can do is return window.confirm. Now in a real world application, you may use something a little bit more advanced than the confirm method on the window, but essentially this is a nice easy method to test out because it returns either true or false. It will return false if the user presses cancel, and it will return true if the user accepts the message. So we can just say, are you sure you want to leave? So we can simply save this out and go and check it out in the browser. So in the browser, we can go ahead and select a few messages. We don't have any alerts. We can type a message. However, when we go and click away somewhere, it says, are you sure you want to leave? So if we press cancel, you can see that we haven't gone anywhere. However, if we press send, we can navigate away. We can go ahead and type another message. We can try and navigate away, and it says, are you sure you want to leave? Now, if we press OK, we will actually navigate away. So what we've done in this lesson is add a property to our mail view component just to detect whether we have unsaved changes. Now, these may not be as common as using something like an activate root guard. However, they come in really handy if you want to alert the user that they're about to make a change or navigate away that may destroy their unsaved changes. Now, unsaved changes isn't the only use case for these. However, for this example, it makes perfect sense. So our root guard is a simple root guard. We import the can activate, we implement it against our mail view component. It then gives us the correct component because in our mail module, the routing object that we bind it to actually gives us the correct component. This then simply gets called when we try and navigate away from this particular rooted component. And all we're doing is quite a simple check inside of here. We're saying if the component has unsaved changes, we'll create that alert. Now, if we do not have unsaved changes, then we can just simply assume that it's clear to actually transition away from the current root, and we can just return true.